What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our starts and sits for the running back position for week 5 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And of course, feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Starts, sits, adds, drops, waiver wire trades, quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, kickers, defense, whatever it may be. Let me know in the comments down below. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday night football. We've got the Colts at the Broncos, and we've got two starting running backs for both teams dealing with injuries. One injury not as serious as the other. But let's start with Jonathan Taylor, who I'm always going to have as a start, even with the dip in overall production thus far in the 2022 fantasy football season. When I made the waiver wire video for week 5, the initial news that I had was that Jonathan Taylor could play in Thursday night football, and then I had news that he might miss up to 4 weeks. But now, at the time that I'm recording this, as of an hour ago, Jonathan Taylor has a chance to play Thursday. The concern for fantasy managers is the original fear that Taylor had suffered a high ankle sprain. Overall, for Jonathan Taylor, the tests on his ankle have come back negative, so we really need to be paying attention to his practice time throughout the week. And I do still think, even against a tough Broncos defense, that Jonathan Taylor is just a player who needs to be in your starting lineups. But with the overall inconsistency that he's shown on the season and the overall downtrend for the Colts as a whole offensively, there's a possibility that Jonathan Taylor is going to end up in the flex position or just be downgraded to an RB2 on your roster. But I think if he is listed as healthy, he is a start going into Thursday night football. If he is not, we need to keep an eye on Deon Jackson and Nyheim Hines as the two starters going into Thursday for the Colts. On the other hand, we have awful news at the time that I'm recording this. Javonte Williams is officially going to be missing the rest of the 2022 season with a torn ACL. The MRIs on today did confirm that. So it's awful, man. You hate to see this. I hate to see any injury to any player that's going to knock them out for the rest of the year. I do think you can flex the remaining Broncos running backs. We put Javonte on the screen in honor of, all of you guys who did draft Javonte Williams going into the 2022 season. But let's talk about both running backs who we will be looking at, right? We got Melvin Gordon and we've got Mike Boone. I still think going into week 5, Mike Boone is a running back you need to consider stashing, because overall we're going to see the same committee deployed for the Broncos running backs. But I don't think that Melvin Gordon or Mike Boone are anything more than a flex going into Thursday, because we just haven't seen these two on the field without Javonte Williams involved. I think Gordon is the better flex going into Thursday night football, but you probably want to tamper your overall expectations, as really none of the Broncos running backs had a lot of success in week 4 going up against the Raiders, who've been very bad against the run. And this week they get the Colts defense, who is probably slightly better, at least overall, against the running back position. So overall, Jonathan Taylor, a start for me. If he is healthy, the Broncos running backs no more than a flex moving into week 5. All right, Giants at Packers. No doubt in my mind you are starting Saquon Barkley on a weekly basis. He is a top 2 running back in all scoring formats. I don't care what defense he's going up against. I don't care what the game script looks like. Barkley is in your starting lineups. 32.4 points in week 1, 11.8 in week 2, 22.6 in week 3, 18.2 in week 4. Say no more. I mean, come on, guys. It's a no-brainer. Don't get smart. Barkley is going to be in your lineups going against the Packers in week 5. It does not bother me one bit. Aaron Jones is still coming in as your RB10 overall. So we got Jones and we got Dillon on the Green Bay Packers. Definitely an interesting committee to watch thus far throughout the season. I really thought AJ Dillon would be a little bit more productive overall. I do think that because you have both running backs capping each other's ceilings, and because Aaron Jones still offers a lot of inconsistency overall, they are perfect flex players, especially Aaron Jones, because he holds so much more upside overall. 14.5 fantasy points in week 4 for Aaron Jones, 9.4 for AJ Dillon. So a little bit better overall in terms of actual production coming out of both running backs. Aaron Jones had 16 rushing attempts and 3 receptions. AJ Dillon had 17 rushing attempts and 1 reception. So it's still pretty close to a 50-50 split overall, and for that reason I'm going to leave them as flexes, but I do think they are both strong flexes going against this Giants defense moving into week 5. All right, Lions at Patriots. Let's just assume DeAndre Swift is going to miss week 5. If he does not, he is definitely going to be a player you can start hands down. I still have faith in DeAndre Swift, even with how good Jamal Williams is playing right now. Jamal Williams is a top 6 fantasy running back, and just don't forget that 3 out of the 4 games he's played, DeAndre Swift was active. So week 4 against Seattle with Swift out, 23.9 fantasy points, 19 rushing attempts, 108 rushing yards, and 2 scores, as well as 1 reception. We barely saw Craig Reynolds get involved, man. Just 2 rushing attempts for Craig Reynolds and 1 reception. Man, the Lions have the faith in Jamal Williams, and I think there's a very strong chance that they sit DeAndre Swift in week 5 against a New England team that is missing their starting quarterback and maybe missing their backup quarterback. I mean, I think this is a easy game overall for the Lions, a game that they can come out of with a victory. So I think Swift has a very strong chance to be sat in week 5 and rested through the week 6 bye week. So I say Jamal Williams, an absolute start for me heading in to week 5. Let's talk about the New England Patriots running backs overall, who continue to be productive, right? Damian Harris, 15.4 fantasy points in week 4. Ramondre Stevenson landed 12.9 fantasy points. When we look at the quarterback position, I don't know when Mac Jones is going to be ready. I don't know if he's going to be ready for week 5. I don't know if Brian Hoyer is going to be ready for week 5. We might see Bailey Zappi out there again in week 5, but regardless of if it's Zappi, Hoyer, or Mac Jones, overall I'm a fan of the Patriots running backs in the flex position, because this offense has to rely on the running back position. Really, the skill position players are not strong enough, and with all the question marks at the quarterback position, Belichick really doesn't have any other choice but to hand Damian Harris the football 18 times and Ramondre Stevenson the football 14 times and give them both a couple of targets like we saw in week 4. So I like both players, but they are capping each other's ceiling, so they are both flexes for me moving into week 5. All right, Chargers at Browns. I told you guys, please don't panic about Austin Ekeler, please. And I told you guys I loved this matchup going against the Houston Texans in week 4. Weeks 1 through 3, Austin Ekeler had at least 11.2 fantasy points and a high of 18.4 in full PPR. So if you do play in full PPR, he wasn't getting you bad fantasy stat lines. We just weren't seeing those massive ceilings that we were used to last season. But after the 33.9 fantasy performance in week 4 against Houston, where he had 3 overall touchdowns, 2 on the ground, 1 through the air, he is coming in as RB3 and full PPR, so I don't think Ekeler is disappointing whatsoever. It's another good matchup against the Browns, although they're definitely better than the Texans. I think it's a good game script, a good enough matchup to easily have Austin Ekeler, who you're going to have in your starting lineups regardless of the defense he's facing in week 5. Nick Chubb, on the other hand, is your RB1 in all scoring formats through the first 4 weeks of the season. He is playing monster football this year. 81 rushing attempts, 459 rushing yards, 5 touchdowns, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 37 receiving yards. He is playing phenomenal football, guys. In PPR scoring formats, he has 85.6 fantasy points through the first 4 games of the season. There's not much else to say here. Chubb is in your starting lineup week in and week out as long as he's healthy. Kareem Hunt continues to be a player you can flex. He just doesn't have a very high ceiling because Chubb has been the guy that the Browns want on the field. But overall, you know, he had 68 total yards in week 4. He's not netting bad yardage. He's just not finding the end zone like we saw in week 1, and we can definitely see how high of a fantasy ceiling he can have when he does find the end zone. He's coming in as RB21 overall. He gets the Chargers this week. You're just playing a little bit of a gamble with Kareem Hunt because if he doesn't find the end zone, the overall fantasy stat line is not too great. So he remains a flex for me moving into week 5. All right, Texans at Jaguars. Listen, this Jaguars defense is pretty stout overall, although they didn't play great against the Eagles in week 4, but the Eagles are arguably the best, if not top 5 offense easily in the league at the moment. And Dameon Pierce, the Houston Texans will face that Jaguars defense here in week 5, but I still am a huge fan of starting Pierce in week 5 overall. 16.1 points in week 3, 25.9 in week 4. So we had the 2 down weeks in the first 2 weeks of the season, but Dameon Pierce is really taking 14 rushing attempts, 131 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 6 targets, 6 receptions, which was really nice in PPR scoring formats to see that usage. Overall, like I said, 25.9 fantasy points against the Chargers in week 4, and he had a 75-yard touchdown run. We are starting to see why there is so much hype around Dameon Pierce in the offseason. We're starting to see that finally come to light. He is easily a start for me heading into week 5. All right, looking at James Robinson and the Jaguars running back core. Robinson came back to earth in week 4 in a bad game script, a game that had very bad weather against the Philadelphia Eagles. So I would not panic. James Robinson went from a top 5 fantasy running back back to running back 13 in full PPR after having just 1.9 fantasy points in week 4 against Philadelphia. But we just talked about Austin Ekeler and what he did to the Houston Texans defense on the ground. James Robinson is a must start in my eyes heading into week 5. I absolutely love this matchup for Robinson and the Jaguars as well. Travis Etienne is a sit for me though. 3.2 fantasy points in week 4. In my humble opinion, at this point in the season, Etienne is no more than a handcuff. But we have a nice sample size coming up in terms of schedule for the Jaguars. Week 5, Houston. Week 6, Indy. Week 7, the Giants. We should be able to get a clear understanding of Travis Etienne's usage through these next 3 games. I don't think you necessarily need to panic and drop Etienne, but at the moment he's going to be remaining on the bench until we see a consistent pattern emerge that gives us confidence. So overall, he is a sit for me moving into week 5. All right, Falcons at Buccaneers. Listen, I'm sitting the Falcons running backs. Cordero Patterson was placed on the IR today. He will miss at least 4 weeks. Tyler Algier is the player for me to go after on the waiver wire, but Caleb Huntley had 10 touches for 56 yards and a score in week 4, so he's definitely a player to keep an eye on as well. I think Algier holds more upside overall. 84 rushing yards on the ground for Algier in week 4 against Cleveland, so he averaged 8.4 yards per carry. So keep an eye on Algier for sure, and keep an eye on Huntley in this game and throughout the week. They both need to be added off the waiver wires and used in the next coming 4 weeks. But this matchup against the Buccaneers is not a good matchup. They have been very stout against the run outside of week 4, where CEH and Isaiah P really started to get some leverage against them, especially in the red zone. But I do think that had more to do with the game script and the Chiefs offense as a whole. So I'll sit both the Falcons running backs going into week 5 against the Bucks, but like I said, they both need to be scooped up and at least rostered for the time being. Leonard Fournette, on the other hand, finally found the end zone. 7 targets, 7 receptions, and a receiving touchdown in week 4 against Kansas City for Lenny Fournette. Guys, on the ground, he was awful. He was really bad. 3 rushing attempts for -3 rushing yards. It was bad, but he made up for it, especially in full PPR leagues, through the air. And that's what we saw a lot of last year, is that Fournette and Brady had really good chemistry through the air. So hopefully that continues. Listen, the game script was bad here. The Buccaneers were playing from behind the majority of this game, and overall was not a good day on the ground. But I do like Leonard Fournette going against the Falcons defense, who have played pretty well overall, but I still like the game script involved here. It's an important divisional game for the Buccaneers. I think Fournette, who I almost put as a flex, but after finding the end zone finally in week 4, he's a start for me moving into week 5. All right, Steelers at Bills. It's a tough matchup for Najee Harris. I've got him downgraded to a flex on the week. And also, I mean, I know it's not a great game script in week 4. Jets forced the Steelers to really have to throw the football in this game, but 18 rushing attempts for 74 rushing yards is not bad by any means. It was his best yards per carry average on the season, but he did not have a single reception. He did not find the end zone, so he was kind of tampered overall at 7.4 fantasy points in all scoring formats. Like I said, he's probably a low-end RB1 or a flex for me going up against the Bills. I think it's going to be tough for the Steelers to keep this game competitive, so I'm a little bit worried about my guy Najee, but all it takes is for the Steelers to get into the red zone once and hand Najee the rock once or twice to give him a chance to get in the end zone, and he has a respectable fantasy stat line, so I definitely think he's still worth flexing heading into week 5. All right, Devin Singletary of the Buffalo Bills has double-digit fantasy points in his last 2 games. He gets a Pittsburgh Steelers defense that has been playing very, very bad since TJ Watt has not been on the field. So I like Singletary as a flex because, once again, I mean, just Singletary is always going to be capped because of the way this offense is ran. But 10.6 fantasy points in week 5, 24.1 in week 3 gives me some confidence to go ahead and throw him in the flex if you don't have better options moving into week 5. All right, Dolphins at Jets. Listen, the Jets have not been great against the run. Raheem Mostert had 10.1 fantasy points in week 4 against the Bengals. Chase Edmonds had 10 fantasy points against the Bengals. So I've got them as a sit because I just think it's too inconsistent. Edmonds is your RB30 in full PPR. Mostert is your RB40. The pattern here is just not giving me enough confidence. If I had to pick one, it would be Chase Edmonds, who does have double-digit fantasy points in full PPR in 3 out of his first 4 games, but I just don't like the consistency here. Then the other factor here is Teddy Bridgewater will be the starting quarterback as Tua continues through concussion protocol. Bridgewater played pretty well in relief of Tua on Thursday Night Football, don't get me wrong, but I'm just a little bit worried overall about this offense. Although the Jets don't look great defensively, I don't feel too confident starting the Dolphins running backs. If I absolutely had to, I think they're okay at the flex, and I would much rather flex Chase Edmonds than Raheem Mostert. Let's talk about Breece Hall, who now has at least 15 fantasy points in his last 2 games. I like Breece Hall this week. I liked him a lot versus the Steelers last week. He was a player who I really encourage you guys to flex. He has 17 targets in his last 2 games. He's playing good football and good fantasy football without finding the end zone too often. He only has 2 touchdowns on the season, 1 through the air, 1 through the ground. So Miami's defense is pretty good, don't get me wrong. So Breece Hall, I think, is still a solid flex, but I think all it's going to take is one breakout game, and Hall is really going to elevate into a starting running back who we can start confidently. But it is a tough stretch coming up: Miami, Green Bay, Denver, New England, Buffalo. So there's some tough matchups in the coming weeks. We'll definitely get a good idea of how the Jets are going to look offensively and what to expect overall from this running back room. Michael Carter is downgraded to sit for me after he has only had 5.6 or less fantasy points in his last 2 games after having 17 in week 1 and 10 in week 2. It looks like Breece Hall is starting to emerge as the primary runner in week 4. Michael Carter had 4 rushing attempts. Breece Hall had 17. So I'll put Breece Hall as the running back I would like to start for the New York Jets, and Michael Carter as the running back I would like to sit moving into week 5. All right, Bears at Vikings. Khalil Herbert was a bit of a disappointment in week 4 against the Giants, netting just 11.1 fantasy points, 77 rushing yards, and 1 reception for 24 receiving yards. No scores against the Giants. I really thought he would have a much better game. I considered him a must start last week, but that's kind of the issue here, is the Bears offense is just not good. There's not a lot of support overall outside of the run game, but the one thing you can count on is that the Bears are going to run the football. So obviously David Montgomery missed week 4 with an ankle and a knee injury. There is a chance he misses week 5. If he does not, I still think you can flex Khalil Herbert and start Montgomery. If Montgomery sits in week 5, I think you can start Khalil Herbert. I do think that the Bears are running the football enough that with the injuries to Montgomery, we can actually start both of these running backs, or at least flex both these running backs when healthy, similar to what we see with the Dallas Cowboys offense, where I'm not opposed to flexing Ezekiel Elliott or Tony Pollard on a weekly basis, but you just have to understand the risk that is involved. The nice thing with the Bears, though, like I've been saying, is that they will run the football, and you can definitely rely on both running backs getting touches. So it's going to depend on Montgomery's health in terms of who we're starting, who we're flexing moving into week 5. But I do think both are worth starting, at least in the flex position, going against the Vikings in week 5. All right, Dalvin Cook had 20 rushing attempts in week 4 while dealing with a shoulder injury. We saw just 3 rushing attempts for Alexander Mattison, but Alexander Mattison did have 1 reception that did place him in the end zone for a touchdown. So he still had an okay fantasy day at 8.8 fantasy points. Dalvin Cook is still your primary runner. He played through this same injury last year. Chicago's defense has not looked good. They haven't looked awful, don't get me wrong, but I still would give the upside to the Vikings offense in this matchup. 76 rushing yards on the ground for Cook, 2 receptions in week 4. Did not find the end zone, but I still think he's a solid low-end RB1 moving into week 5. All right, Titans at Commanders. I begged you guys after the first 2 weeks of the season, please do not panic on Derrick Henry. He now has had at least 23 fantasy points in his last 2 matchups, and he gets a Washington Commanders team that has struggled to stop literally anybody and everybody through the first 4 weeks of the season. Derrick Henry is coming in as your RB9 in full PPR, your RB6 in standard scoring formats. He's an absolute must start against the Commanders in week 5, point blank. Let's move on. Let's talk about the Commanders running backs. We got a tricky situation here after Antonio Gibson had his worst fantasy performance of the year in week 4 against Dallas. 20 points in week 1, 12.1 in week 2, 11 in week 3, 9.3 in week 4 against Dallas. And now it is looking like Brian Robinson is going to have the potential to play in week 5, could make his season debut. Ron Rivera's come out and said that things are looking very promising. So I think you can still consider flexing Antonio Gibson against a Titans defense that has not been great. And I do think it's a little risky to go ahead and start Brian Robinson right out the gate. You could downgrade Gibson to a watch as well. I just want to sit back and kind of see what happens and see what usage we get out of the Washington Commanders. And that's probably going to continue to change in the next coming of weeks. But Gibson has not been playing bad football. The Commanders have been playing bad football, but Gibson is still RB19 in full PPR, nothing crazy. But like I said, double-digit fantasy performances in the first 3 weeks of the season, then a very bad day overall for the Washington Commanders offensively in week 4, and he netted just 9.3 fantasy points. So I'm not going to be surprised if we see a committee here. I'm not going to be surprised if this is a very frustrating backfield to navigate for the rest of the fantasy season. But Gibson, I think, is still worth a flex. And I think Robinson, we just want to kind of hold off and see what usage he gets against the Titans moving into week 5. All right, Seahawks at Saints, man. As week 4 started to move along, especially towards the end of the weeks, I started to say, man, I don't have a lot of faith in Rashaad Penny with what we've seen on the season. But man, this matchup against the Lions is pretty darn good. You should probably be considering starting Penny in week 4 if you do own him. And gosh, did he go absolutely wild. 28.7 fantasy points, 17 rushing attempts, 151 rushing yards, 2 scores, and he added 1 reception. I mean, this could be kind of what we needed to see to get Rashaad Penny really going and back to what we saw last year at the end of the season. The Saints defense is a much tougher matchup than Detroit, but with the usage we saw last week and hopefully the confidence of the coaching staff and Pete Carroll, we may very well see Rashaad Penny with another good fantasy stat line. He's not going to have 28 points against the Saints, but I do think he can get enough usage that he's a solid flex going into this matchup against the Saints in week 5. Looking at these Saints running backs, I mean, I just don't know what to do here, guys. I mean, I do think that the matchup is good enough that you want to start a Saints running back, but I just don't know. Is Kamara going to be healthy? Well, hopefully. If Kamara is healthy, I don't even know how confident I am having him in your starting lineup outside of the flex position. Like, if this was a tough matchup, I probably would be saying to sit Kamara, but it's a good matchup against the Seahawks, who just got absolutely, I mean, they beat the Lions, don't get me wrong, but they are giving up a lot of points, and they are not playing too well against the running back position. And I don't know here, guys. Latavius Murray, 13.5 fantasy points in week 4, 57 yards on the ground and a touchdown. Mark Ingram had 30 rushing yards and 3 receptions in week 4, and we saw Mark Ingram score in week 3. So it's just a big old question mark here. There's going to be a Saints running back who is worth starting in this matchup, but I just don't know who it's going to be. So if you want to take the gamble on one of them, I think it's definitely fine looking at the matchup, but I just don't know, out of Kamara, Murray, and Ingram, who exactly we should be starting moving into week 5. All right, Niners at Panthers. I think Jeff Wilson is still a strong enough flex. At the time I'm recording this, the Monday Night Football game has not yet happened, and I do think that it's a tough matchup, right? Like, there's a chance that Jeff Wilson doesn't have a great game. The Rams are a top 10 run defense, but I wouldn't lose too much faith going up against Carolina, who's played okay defensively throughout the year. I think you can still consider flexing Jeff Wilson, as the Niners probably need the help overall with Jimmy Garoppolo at the quarterback position, but probably more of this decision will be based on how does Jeff Wilson play in week 4 and what is your personal confidence level. You probably have better options at the flex than Jeff Wilson. Christian McCaffrey, finally a game on this season to make you feel really, really good, right? 25.8 fantasy points after having no more than 16.8 fantasy points in the first 3 weeks of the season, which is still quite good. Don't get me wrong, he's your RB5 and full PPR at the moment, but fantasy managers were just wanting to see those higher ceilings out of CMC, and we saw it in week 4 against Arizona. 87 yards on the ground, 9 targets, 9 receptions, 81 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown. We really needed to see that involvement in the passing game take an uptick, and man, this offense through the air looks bad. I don't know when, but I definitely think we're going to see a quarterback change if Baker Mayfield does not step it up. And I do think that what we've seen on the season, Sam Darnold is probably better for CMC's fantasy output. But regardless, let's get back to week 5. It is a little bit of a tough matchup against the Niners here in week 5, but let's face it, you're starting Christian McCaffrey regardless of what defense he's going up against. CMC is a must start moving in to week 5. All right, Eagles at Cardinals. I've got Miles Sanders as a start. I mean, head coach Nick Sirianni has come out and said, I mean, Miles Sanders is our #1 back, and it sure has looked like that on the season. Kenneth Gainwell has had moments throughout the season where he's been productive. We have barely seen anything out of Boston Scott, but a majority of what we've seen on the season is that Miles Sanders is the guy for the Eagles. 18.5 fantasy points in week 1, 11.6 in week 2, just 5.4 points in week 3, but a lot of that had to do with the game script. The Eagles were absolutely decimating the Commanders, and in week 4, 29.6 fantasy points, 134 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, 2 receptions. He is your RB8 in full PPR. At this time, Miles Sanders is no longer a flex player. He is your RB2 on your starting lineup, and that's probably where you drafted him. And you're probably feeling pretty good right now because you've got an RB1 in front of him. Sanders is a must start on a weekly basis, part of one of the best offenses in the entire league. James Conner continues to be a flex for me, coming in as RB29 overall in full PPR. 15.5 fantasy points in week 1, 7.1 in week 2, 8.7 in week 3. Did have a much better week compared to the last 2 weeks in week 4 at 10.7 fantasy points. Maybe not a much better week, but a better overall week, at least in full PPR scoring formats. 55 yards on the ground, 3 receptions, 22 receiving yards. We really want to see some of those touchdowns that we saw last season come back. It has been a hard year if you own James Conner and you don't play in full PPR. We really need to see those touchdowns emerge again. I like this matchup overall between the Eagles and the Cardinals, though. Yes, it's a tough matchup for James Conner, but I like the game script involved here. I do think this is a game that we could see the Eagles maybe give up more points than we've seen on the season. I really think if the Cardinals can step it up offensively, it could be a good day for James Conner, although his ceiling is still tampered by the Philadelphia Eagles defense that is playing very, very good. All right, Cowboys at Rams. Ezekiel Elliott has had double-digit fantasy points in the last 2 weeks, while on the other hand, Tony Pollard had 1.8 points in week 4 and 10.5 in week 3, 19.8 in week 2, 4.2 in week 1. So I don't really know what to do with this backfield, as Ezekiel Elliott had 5.9 fantasy points in the first 2 games of the season. Like I talked about earlier, they're flexes for me because you just don't know exactly what you're going to get. It's a tough matchup going up against the Rams. So if you have better flex options, then I say you sit Zeke and Tony Pollard. But if you don't, they're okay. But yeah, it's a pretty steep matchup. Like Washington and the Giants weren't steep matchups, and they fared pretty well overall, except for Pollard getting 1.8 points against the Commanders. So like I said, no more than a flex for me for Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard moving in to week 5. I'm putting the Rams running backs as sits because I just don't see good enough ceilings here, and I think it's a tough matchup. Like I mentioned earlier, at the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played yet, but it's a tough matchup in week 4 going against the Niners. And so far with what we've seen on the season, we just don't have a crazy high ceiling for either running back, and they're definitely eating into each other's ceiling. So I'm going to put them as a sit against a Dallas Cowboys defense that's playing very good against the run. But there's always a chance that Akers or Henderson finds the end zone. It's just too much of a gamble for me. I think you probably have better overall options on your roster. So I'll put Akers and Henderson as sits moving into week 5. All right, Bengals at Ravens. I've got Joe Mixon as a start. At least 11.3 fantasy points in 3 out of the first 4 games on the year. A bad day in week 3 versus the Jets, but outside of that, he's done pretty well. He had his first touchdown in week 4 against Miami, which really helped his stat line overall. 61 yards on the ground and 1 touchdown on the ground, 4 receptions overall. That netted just 17.4 fantasy points. He's RB14 in full PPR right now. I think he continues to be a running back that you start on a weekly basis. J.K. Dobbins came to life in week 4 against Buffalo. 22.3 fantasy points, 41 yards on the ground, a touchdown on the ground, 4 receptions, and a touchdown through the air. Really like what we saw out of Dobbins. I thought he would continue to be kind of moved back into the offense a little bit slowly. I didn't love the matchup. I didn't love him as a start last week, and he sure as anything proved us wrong. 22.3 fantasy points, like I said. So I like Dobbins as a flex. The only reason I'm still hesitant about Dobbins is because you just don't know what you're going to get out of the Ravens backfield with Lamar Jackson running the football, with the inconsistency at the running back position. We still saw Justice Hill have 8 rushing attempts for 45 rushing yards. Mike Davis was not a factor. Kenyon Drake was not a factor, but overall, Dobbins only had 13 touches for 41 yards on the ground. He just had the bulk of the carries and the 1 target in the end zone, which is definitely what's important, right? Those red zone, end zone touches, I should say, right? So still like Dobbins moving in to week 5, but I think he's best at the flex position. But you can still consider him a flex running back who has a nice ceiling like we saw in week 4. All right, Raiders at Chiefs. I've got Josh Jacobs as a flex, who after week 4 comes in as your RB7 in full PPR, 34.5 fantasy points in week 4. He had a monster day after a pretty lackluster start to the season. 144 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, 5 receptions for 31 receiving yards. He gets Kansas City in week 5. Denver wasn't a great matchup, so at this point, I think Jacobs stays in your starting lineup at the flex. A little bit of inconsistency on the season. 8.3 points in week 1, 9.1 in week 2. Then he started turning up against Tennessee, 13.7. Then he went wild in week 4. So just due to the pure inconsistency we've seen so far, I think he's best off as a flex unless you truly don't have better options, and he's fine as an RB2. But man, what a week for Josh Jacobs. I do think he is definitely a running back you can consider moving into week 5. On the other hand, we've got Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who's coming in as RB4 overall and is looking very good. I mean, I was a little hesitant about CEH going up against the Buccaneers, and he played just fine. 92 yards on the ground, 1 score, 2 overall targets, 1 reception, and the red zone for a touchdown, 22.4 fantasy points. He had 22.4 fantasy points in week 1, 15.8 in week 2, 14.9 in week 3, and then, like I said, 22.4 in week 4. And like I said, that makes him RB4 in full PPR and standard scoring formats. Las Vegas has not been good against the run for majority of the season, and that makes CEH a must start heading into week 5. And as long as his production continues, he's going to be a must start running back for the remainder of the fantasy season, as long as he is healthy. Really, with how this Chiefs offense has changed throughout the offseason with the departure of Tyreek Hill, the Chiefs are just getting craftier than ever in the end zone, and CEH has been a huge part of that. And although Isaiah P did get a good amount of touches in this game with 11 rushing attempts, we haven't seen that been consistent on the season, and Jerick McKinnon has been all over the place as well. So CEH still feels like the lead back for me, and definitely a running back who is a must start going into week 5. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, we put out free daily fantasy football content. Really does help us out, and you guys consider subscribing to the channel. And feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Starts, sits, adds, drops, the waiver wire, trades, running backs, quarterbacks, receivers, tight ends, kickers, defense, whatever it may be, let me know and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Make sure to check out all of our links down below, and be sure to join us for our next live stream of the week 4 fantasy Q&A, as well as general fantasy discussion. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.